Hello, thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity to talk about the Georgian media environment and its main challenges this year. Let me start from the context of the year. Just recently, on October 31st, we had parliamentary elections. The main novelty of these elections was that they were held with so-called almost proportional system and low barrier, allowing to elect a more diverse and politically balanced parliament that could reduce the likelihood of one-party dominance, as it was in the previous decades. The system change came as a result of several constitutional amendments and electoral codes, several round and negotiation tables between the parties with the facilitation of diplomats accredited in Georgia and non-stop civil society protests organized by civic movement SHAME. I will briefly touch also upon COVID-19 pandemics that has affected the media environments worldwide. Georgian media landscape is mainly described as robust, competitive, and pluralistic, but highly polarized, with television channels being aligned with one political party or another. According to the most recent public opinion polls, television still remains the main source of news and information for the majority of the country's population. Let's say they prefer the internet and Facebook in particular. As you can see on this slide, the Facebook is the most popular social network in Georgia. 72% of the citizens say they fully or partly trust the media. The presentation will try to cover the legal environment, safety of journalists, and some other key factors that influence the media environment in Georgia. Freedom of expression is guaranteed by the Constitution and liberal media legislation in Georgia. The law does consider some restrictions. However, it also states that benefits gained by the restrictions must exceed the harm to freedom of expression. The Georgian National Communication Commission regulates the country's telecommunications and broadcast media. By law, the GNCC is an independent regulatory body. However, its practices are often criticized by media and watchdog organizations as loyal to the government. Before going to the legal environment where GNCC plays an important role, we need to better understand the nature of GNCC's decisions and behavioral practices. Civil society organizations observe that the GNCC has an expressly negative attitude toward media organizations without editorial policies. Sorry, it's the quote. That GNCC has an expressly negative attitude towards media organizations whose editorial policies are critical of the government. For example, in 2019, the Commission has established the Media Academy that launched Media Critic platform. The purpose of the platform is to analyze and assess media production in order to improve their quality. According to the Media Development Foundation, which has conducted the monitoring of the articles published on MEDIACRITIC.GE, quote, mainly the media outlets disloyal to the government were subject to criticism. According to the monitoring results, the platform never discussed those media outlets that spread anti-Western propaganda, end of the quote. Reporters Without Borders, in line with the local civil society organizations, expressed concern that Media Critic serves to discredit the media independent from and critical to the government, including not only TV channels, but also independent online outlets, NetGazeti.GE and ON.GE. And just bear in mind that these online media outlets are the highest quality of media in Georgia in general. You see the quote from the RSF on the slide and the illustration of one of the sponsored articles of Media Critic with the caption stating that opposition, quote again, opposition media was creating a virtual reality by exaggerating not only desired facts, numbers, and events, but also by hiding not desirable circumstances. And now back to the controversial laws proposed by the GNCC. The draft laws aimed at several amendments to law on Georgia on electronic communications and law of Georgia on broadcasting, that, in opinion of watchdog organizations, would allow the committee to get direct and indirect leverages to intervene into broadcasting and limit freedom of expression without any due justification. In particular, the amendment to the law on electronic communications entitled the Communication Commission without any judicial control to appoint a special manager, in some documents mentioned as designated representative, to organizations that are authorized in the field of electronic communications, including the media organizations. The special manager was allowed to take any managerial decision, including alienation of shares. Thus, the law would allow the committee, by appointing a special manager, to take managerial decisions and intervene into the editorial independence. The amendment to the law on broadcasting aimed at not allowing the broadcasters to retain the decision of the commission if and while they appeal to the court. For instance, according to the norm, if the committee suspends or revokes the broadcast license, this decision becomes effective and the broadcaster has to stop broadcasting and wait for the court decision that, in opinion of watchdog organizations, will cause damage to a broadcaster. The broadcaster representatives of telecom industry and non-governmental media watchdog organizations have provided robust argumentations and were able to get a modified version of the proposal where ground for appointing a special manager is limited to the extent that in a present edition, it would be almost impossible to appoint them to the broadcaster. While these two potential risks to freedom of media have been overcome, the third one still remains. Particularly in 2018, GNCC has proposed amendments to law on broadcasting in order to regulate libel, defamation, false news, and hate speech. This proposition is not yet initiated in the Parliament, however, still remains on the agenda and discussions might be renewed by the end of the year. Media and watchdog organizations have called the draft law vague and a threat to freedom of expression. The main argument is that according to the draft law, the media content is becoming a subject of regulation by GNCC and possibly courts instead of self-regulation as it was before. We need here to understand the local political context and be very, very careful. Georgian government and representatives of the ruling party often express discontent with coverage and non-convenient questions of the critical media. So it might be quite that they will use these laws against the critical and independent media who are criticizing the government representatives of the ruling party. In addition, the GNCC is considered as not politically independent organization, and therefore media and civil society organizations are concerned that these amendments will allow the committee to pressure the critical media and limit freedom of expression. However, the field professionals wish the professional standards and quality of media content to improve, but they see the opportunity in strong, independent, self-regulatory mechanisms and professional training of journalists and not in regulation of the content and interventions into the editorial independence of media. Accepting the need to address the hate speech and increase sensitivity of media towards the issue, the civil society organizations call to consider Georgian context and positions of all stakeholders and work towards more public good instead of limiting the freedom of expression and allowing authorities to manipulate with directive of the European Parliament and of the Council in their own political interests. Now I will go to this topic of safety of journalists and try to give brief overview of the problem. Article 1054 of the Criminal Code criminalizes acts that prevent journalists from fulfilling their duties, for example, coercing a journalist into dissemination or not dissemination of information, and the same act committed using threat of violence or official position shall be punished. This is what the law states. However, the law does not cover broad aspects of those acts that are essential to journalists. For example, gathering of information and data analysis. It is also important to amend the law in order to cover the whole spectrum of acts and consider any criminal offense motivated with prevention of journalists from fulfilling their duties as an aggravating circumstance. Also, it is important to investigate the threats and violations against journalists effectively and in accordance to the European Convention of Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. Media Advocacy Coalition believes that on one hand, the insufficient criminal code, and on the other, its inappropriate limited application, long-drawn investigations, or inattention to the calls to investigate cases of abuse against journalists created a sense of impunity among the media community. Violence against journalists thus goes mostly unpunished, and some of the provisions of the criminal code are used in relation to physical assaults or the threats of violence in order to avoid classifying the attacks on free speech. Pressure on independent private media is ongoing challenge to Georgian media. Founders, managers, and the family members of the three biggest and independent from the government TV companies were involved into the court proceedings or were detained. For instance, Georgi Rurua, co-owner and founder of Tavari Archi, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Civil society organizations issued a joint statement saying that violations during the detention, personal search, investigation, and existing context raises reasonable grounds that the process was politically motivated. Prosecutor's office has several charges against Nik Agvaramia, co-owner and the general director of Tavari Archi. In connection of the case of Rustavi II, a founder and director of Formula TV, Zurab Gumbaridze, was summoned to the prosecution service for questioning. And a few days before the parliamentary elections, Aftandil Tsereteli, the father of Vakhtang Tsereteli, the TVPVeli founder, was threatened with death by two unknown men, as he stated, if his son's television won't change it critical to the government editorial policy. He too is also facing criminal charges. We need to bear in mind that at any moment, all these cases against the independent media managers pending in the courts can be renewed and used against the independent private media. And it would be appreciated if international institutions, including OSCE, follow the process closely. The freedom of work and safety of the working environment for the journalists is guaranteed by the Constitution and the law of Georgia on freedom of speech and expression. However, in practice, journalists face not only personal verbal attacks from the state authorities, but also acts of violence left uninvestigated and not addressed adequately. In June 2020, Georgian law enforcement arrested a man who allegedly was preparing a plot to assassinate Georgi Gabunia under the command of the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov. A year earlier, Russian officials condemned Gabunia and Kadyrov, questioned or requested bringing criminal charges against him for addressing Russian President Vladimir Putin with obscene language in his primetime political show. About 40 reporters, photojournalists, and cameramen were injured as security forces unexpectedly fired rubber bullets into the crowd when protesters clashed with riot police on June 20, 2019, during so-called Gavrilov's Night. Despite the calls from local and international watchdog organizations on Georgia authorities to investigate the violence against journalists during a protest, the case was not investigated properly. The government has not punished the perpetrators, and the hurt journalists had not been given the status of injured. Therefore, three journalists filed a suit to the European Court of Human Rights, and the court has already accepted their application. Journalists sometimes face physical clashes even during their ordinary working routine. For example, Parliament security officers physically restrained journalists from their work in the Parliament building when, during the hearing of nominations of court judges, journalists attempted to cover the confrontation between the members of the Parliament. At first, journalists were asked to leave the premises, and afterwards, a journalist refused to leave. The security officers pushed and forced them out of the room. According to the Reporters Without Borders, the environment for journalists has worsened in run-up to the parliamentary elections in Georgia. The verbal and physical attacks took place during the pre-election period on the election day. In the pre-election period, Georgian Dream Party activists physically assaulted film crews of Tivim Tavariarchi, and Georgian public broadcaster in the presence of police forces. Their equipment was damaged, yet no one is held responsible for the attack. Journalists of TV Pirveli, Publica, and ONG were also physically attacked on the election day by Georgian Dream and political opposition party activists on the main media advocacy coalition called the police to investigate the cases immediately and ensure secure working environments for journalists because, first of all, they were damaged physically. They could not fulfill their professional duties, and their equipment was also destroyed while they were trying to cover the election day. Verbal attacks is also not novelty unfortunately, for journalists, and it is becoming an alarming trend, not only from the government officials, but unfortunately also from the political opposition and far-right groups. However, the ruling party members lead in that direction. They constantly express their irritation when asked critical questions and accuse journalists in being biased and representing the interest of the United National Movement, the biggest opposition political party. You see some of the expressions the Georgian Dream representative said, and I think the most irritating is the Tbilisi mayor's threat to independent media. You will get a fist of truth in your face. I cannot go in details and describe other cases of threats and abuses, including the case of community radio in Bankesi Gorge and Gelam Tbilishvili, the case of blocking Georgi Gabunia, journalist and anchor in the car after he mentioned Jesus Christ in a joke, and the case of the abbot urging the worshippers to tie up a journalist and force him to leave the church. But if interested, you can see the long version of the text prepared for the conference. The most alarming is still that the majority of the cases were not properly investigated that can cause incitement of the further violence. Besides public verbal and physical assault, journalists raise their concerns regarding the interference into their editorial independence. To start with Adjara TV of the public broadcaster, the difficulties have started in 2019 when the Council of Advisors impeached the General Director Natia Kapanadze and elected Georgi Kokhreidze. The decision was negatively evaluated by the local civil society organizations and international organizations, including OSCE, and as you see on the screen, OSCE Media Freedom representative expressed its concern and said that Yeah, he was worried about recent dismissals and resignations of some public broadcaster, Ajara TV and Radio Key staff in Georgia, and about reported management interference in its editorial policies. Independent service public broadcaster plays a vital societal role and is key to media freedom. After resignation, after the impeachment of Natia Kapanadze, as I mentioned, seen as a politically motivated and groundless attempt to interfere in editorial policies of the broadcaster, the new director said that he dislikes the critical tone of the news journalist and started the process of illegal dismissal and blackmailing of key news journalists and producers. According to the results of the monitoring conducted by Charter of Journalistic Ethics, the editorial policy have changed after the key news journalist left the broadcaster. Important stories were not covered, balance was artificial, and news programs lacked critical content. Journalists tried to defend their editorial independence by founding Ajara TV's alternative trade union, organizing a strike, filing court appeals, and protesting in the streets. Some of them left even the broadcaster, saying that change of the editorial policies was unacceptable. In 2020, also Maestro TV journalist filed a complaint to the Georgian Charter of Journalistic Ethics against Nika Laliashvili, director of Imedi TV, claiming that Laliashvili closed their programs because they refused to change their editorial policy and be less critical to the ruling party and increase critics to United National Movement. Bugging journalists and then presenting their phone conversations on briefings, as it happens in case of Nato Gogelia, TV journalist, threatening them with questioning and asking to identify their sources is another challenge for the journalists that is considered as an unlawful interference into their work. Now let's turn to an important issue of having free access to information. While the laws in general guarantee the access to information, journalists often face limitations that create obstacles to their professional work. Mostly influenced are the investigative journalists who are trying to reveal hidden facts which often concern public officials, online and regional media. The public agencies do not respond to journalists' inquiries in a timely manner. The required data is often incomplete and even withheld, referring to the protection of personal information or privacy rights. The COVID-19 pandemics even worsened the situation in this direction. It is worth noting that the state authorities refuse to participate in the programs of independent from government and critical private media such as Formula TV, Caucasus, and only appeared in government-friendly TV programs of Imedi and Post TV. They even refused to participate in pro-election debates on Palitra TV and joined the last section of the program without their political opponents. That was not helpful for the audiences in making an informed choice. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the population became highly dependent on credible life-saving information. The media were also regarded as an essential business activity and were not suspended during the national curfew. However, there were several instances of state authorities' discriminatory actions towards the independent media outlets. First of all, access to public information was restricted by the ordinance of the government of Georgia, namely the time frame established by the legislation of Georgia for releasing public information and personal information was suspended. Press freedom defenders call the norm not proportional and limiting access to public information for no rational reason. Government structures of medical centers directly involved in fighting the pandemics did not answer or return calls that would help journalists verify or better understand some of the complexities. Lika Zakashvili, who is the chief editor of an online outlet Publica recalls that it was an exceptionally hard period in her professional life. Many journalists would agree, and you can read the quote on the screen. She says that this limited communication hindered their ability to get credible information and adequately report on it. And government agencies and public officials kept repeating the same answers. We don't have time for your questions. There are more important things we have to do. And we have already published all the information you are requesting on the website. I think this is very familiar situation for rest of the journalists. What I want to stress now as well is that during the partial curfew, the government did not treat all independent media equally, granting driving passes to media loyal to the government, while various obstacles were created for critical media in general. State authorities also created barriers to get public information from quarantined regions of Georgia. State authorities and health officials closed their official briefings for journalists, and some even boycotted them as soon as journalists started questioning the adequacy of medical treatment provided to infected individuals, the levels of readiness of the healthcare system to handle the pandemics, the need for testing citizens, etc., etc. Journalists were asked to turn in questions in writing, which allowed state officials to filter them and answer only those that were convenient to answer. Public health officials also have stopped appearing on independent media talk shows, saying there were more important things to do. I don't know if time allows, just very briefly, financial sustainability became more of a challenge during COVID-19 pandemics. For instance, the advertising market shrank dramatically, especially during the pandemics, so commercial income of the media practically vanished, or at best was reduced by half. Most of the business canceled their contracts with media outlets because of the lockdown and inability to continue their own business effectively. Small budget regional media were the most affected, and many struggled even to cover staff salaries. And on March 2020, the financial hardship have resulted in incasso measures for the government, freezing bank accounts of more than 20 media outlets for tax collection purposes. But these measures was applied selectively to media critical of the government and never to pro-governmental critical media. Unfortunately, I think I'm out of time to talk on Russian propaganda and domestic disinformation. However, very quickly, I will outline the most important. Russian propaganda and disinformation are regarded as a considerable component of a hybrid war, mainly targeting so-called Western value systems, including human rights, equality issues, and Georgia's aspirations toward the European Union and NATO membership, thus contributing to nationalism and further radicalization of Georgian public based on ethnic, religious, and gender differences that deepen the process of polarization of the society. In 2019 and 2020, the Facebook was able to identify and remove from its platform several manipulative networks spreading disinformation in order to influence public opinion. According to Facebook, these networks were mostly associated with the ruling Georgian Dream Party and some to the UNM. The several hundreds of connected networks were spreading disinformation, manipulative content, discrediting anti-occupation movement, civic activists, political opponents, civil society organizations, businessmen, and journalists critical of the authorities. What is more disturbing, Georgian government response to disinformation and propaganda is weak and fragmented. The government institutions, together with politicians, seem to misinterpret genuine threats by choosing to challenge critical and independent media as alleged sources of disinformation. So now I will stop talking and will be ready to answer your questions at the end of the session. Thank you very, very much for your attention and joining the conference.